It is my honor to introduce our evening speaker. I've known Maurice for a couple of years, and I've admired him for decades. Maurice is an individual that literally has helped change the world. And when you think about what your speaker for this evening has accomplished, he is an individual who is an excellent role model for young and old. He is a person that has a great mind, has a big heart, and understands leadership, cooperation, and results. He comes to us today from the Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia area of the United States, where he's a vice president at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. But over 20 years ago, he was a rancher in New Zealand. He was a man that was a very successful business person and then became quite disappointed with and frustrated with government. And he sold his business and he ran for the New Zealand Parliament. And then at a certain point, his party became the leader of the New Zealand government. Mr. McTigue became a minister in the government. And as a minister in the government, I won't steal his thunder or his story, but one of the things that he did was he actually, as a member of Parliament, worked to eliminate his job and his ministry within the New Zealand government. When Maurice became part of the inner sanctum, if you will, of the New Zealand government, I hope I have the stats right, Maurice, but over 70% of the entire New Zealand workforce was unionized. Economic growth was almost non-existent. New Zealand was not in the top 60 on the Heritage Foundation Wall Street Journal's Freedom Index, and it was not a place to be. It was not a good place, other than a beautiful place physically, but it was not a good business place to raise a family or to have a career. By the time Maurice left the Parliament, New Zealand had been considered to have created an economic miracle. The Wall Street Journal says that this man was one of the 3 people most responsible for the New Zealand miracle. The country of New Zealand, again, has become an economic dynamo, largely because of people like Maurice McTigue. He then left the New Zealand government and became the New Zealand ambassador to Canada. And many of the great economic reforms, if you're familiar with what's happened in Canada, at least to some degree, are due to this man's advice and his counsel and his friendship with a number of people within the Canadian government. He was given the highest order by the Queen of England for his meritorious service to both Canada and to New Zealand. And he simply is one of the most brilliant, thoughtful, and down-to-earth thinkers in public policy, not just in New Zealand and Canada, but literally on Wednesday, he was advising the newly formed Competitiveness Committee of the state government here in Lansing, Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming a friend and a great patriot, Maurice McTigue.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, and it's great to be back here in Michigan again. It's also great to be back at a function that's being organized by Northwood University. You know, one of the things that I began to realize as a member of Parliament and as a minister was one of the great deficits that we had as representatives were deficits of knowledge. We didn't have good research available to us. We didn't have good knowledge. We particularly didn't have good free market knowledge available to us that we could use and act on. And that's become one of my interests for the last 20 years, and it's one of the things that I applaud about the work that Northwood does. I'm not going to talk to you much tonight about New Zealand. I'm going to talk to you about the United States. But I'm going to draw on examples from a number of countries, New Zealand being one of them. And everything that I talk to you about tonight isn't something that's a theory. it's something that has already been done. So it's something that's been done somewhere. You can pick it up and say, yes, we have the real evidence. This has been used. We're not theorizing here. So when you start to think about being a Minister of Finance or putting together a budget, you need to think about some very basic things first. And in the United States, just having a budget would be a good start. And the idea that you could get away with it is not something that you could even get away with in my country. And if you follow what happens in Canada, you would realize that in 2010, the Canadian government, the Parliament, was prorogued. That means it was discharged because it didn't pass the budget. And they held another election 42 days later. And the Conservatives won a bigger majority. Interestingly, they campaigned on reducing government spending, getting debt under control, and acting in a fiscally responsible manner. And they won an increased majority on that basis. That's good stuff. Makes me feel pretty happy. One of the things that I hear all the time in the United States, and I might blame economists for it because they seem to like the idea, but all of the proposals I hear of are couched in terms of 10 years. Well, that might sound good to an economist, but I can guarantee to you as a politician, there is not a hope in hell that you're going to hold a coalition together for 10 years to get those things done. Will not happen. For your Congress, that means 5 successive elections that you would have to keep people locked on the same path. Not going to happen. So thinking about things in terms of 10 years is a guarantee that you're going to fail. So this is what a budget looks like. And from time to time you have one, and it looks like you might have another one in the near future. So why are budgets important? Well, the reason is that they're actually a strategic document. They actually lay out for the people as well as for the government exactly what it is that the government intends to do. It's also an accountability document as well, because you can then look later on to see whether or not the commitments made were actually achieved. It's the government's plan for improvements to our society. We deserve it. We, the citizens, deserve a budget. It's not just about the people who are in the governing process. It states the progress that's been made since the last budget, sometimes, and that in part is justification for the expenditure going into the next budget period. It also identifies the price of these initiatives, and it also says who's going to pay. So it's a pretty important process. Most of us don't understand it well, but I think most of us also feel uneasy when we don't get one. Paul Ryan has a budget plan, Path to Prosperity. I applaud him for doing that. I don't think it does enough, and I don't think it does it quickly enough. And unfortunately, I think that Paul Ryan is listening a little too much to his friends in Congress and not doing as many of the things that he should do just because they're right. And so I give him credit for that, but it doesn't go far and fast enough. My approach to budgeting is that you should actually do your thinking first before you try and do your decision making. And what I mean by that is that you've got to think about all of the things that you want to achieve in an environment where it's not confused by the numbers. Because you put all the numbers down and all of a sudden we're starting to think about what the outcome looks like rather than is this the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. So if you do your thinking first, the first thing in my view that you have to think about is, so what is all of the material that's open for our review or our discussion? And so we see a lot of these kind of graphs. And what they're really saying in the simplest terms is that the quantity of discretionary spending is getting smaller and smaller. So there's less and less that Congress can do each year. That is totally erroneous. That is not true. Every single part of each one of those pie charts is on the table every year, or it should be. It might be called mandatory spending because you've agreed that so many people are going to get these things. But at any time you can change that by changing how you qualify, what the cost of living adjustments will be, and a whole range of other issues. The same applies to debt servicing. It should be on the table. You've got to look at whether or not you want to acquire more or less debt. You've got to look at whether or not the way in which you're funding your debt at the moment is sensible, and whether or not you should be looking at taking more long-term debt as opposed to short-term debt, all of those issues. But all of that is on the table every year, and if your politicians tell you that it's not, they don't know their job and you shouldn't vote for them again. Okay. So, in my view, the first stage to a budget should be a budget policy statement. And you should make that budget policy statement 6 months before you release the budget. That's what I said, 6 months before you release the budget. And it should set out all of the big initiatives that you intend to undertake without the numbers. We're going to increase our emphasis in this area. We're going to make adjustments here. It should lay out the government's intended achievements. It should also define what's a fiscally responsible budget. I don't know that Congress has ever done that. The Founding Fathers had it in their mind when they wrote the Constitution, but it seems to have lapsed a bit since then. It gives an outline of significant policy changes. So where are you going to make big policy changes? And it considers all the expenditures, discretionary, mandatory, and off-budget spending. So the whole lot. And it identifies significant fiscal risks. Now it does this in an environment where you can talk about a lot of these issues before you get to have to think about the bottom line. And it allows, because it's 6 months ahead, public commentary about the kind of initiatives that you're putting in the budget. So, you can talk about things or you can roll up your sleeves and start to get things done. You'll recognize one of those fellas. The other one was somebody that I know that used to have a real job. And these are some of the things that I would say that you do in that in setting out the principles that are going to drive the decision making on your budget. So, my principles would be these: that the budget balances across all expenditures, that surpluses may not exceed 1% of outlays, that surpluses in excess of 1% must be returned to taxpayers, can't accumulate large reserves. Surpluses are to be used exclusively for debt retirement until debt is under 60% of GDP, and that budget outlays will diminish by 0.5% of GDP annually until they're under 18% of GDP. Now, why would I pick that figure 18%? Well, there's a lot of economists in the United States have looked at the revenue for the United States over long periods of time. Gordon Tullock, who used to be with us, did a lot of work on this, and so did Jim Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And what they found, interestingly enough, is if you go back 70 or 90 years, the total revenue almost always sits at 18% of GDP. And it doesn't matter what the tax rate is. There have been times when the tax rates have been very high, before John F. Kennedy, up in the 70% range bracket, and they've been very low, around the 25%, but it still comes out at about 18. So we don't understand exactly why that happens, but it tells you that there's a natural barrier that says this is the most money you can raise by way of taxation. So that should be a guide to how much money you can actually spend. So that's why the 18% is there. Taxing and spending decisions must identify economic growth and international competitive effects before they're made. Okay. When you look at a budget, you find there's a lot of rubbish in it. So you have to identify that and get rid of it. So here's something that was an initiative that was used by the New Zealand government. If you look at productivity over the last 30 years in the private sector in the United States, it has averaged 3.4% per annum. We did the same, and it came out at about the same number in New Zealand, so we decided that the government was entitled to a productivity dividend. It shouldn't cost you more to do the same work each successive year. It should actually cost you less, because you should get better at it. You've got better machinery, you've got better technology, you've got better ways of doing things. So, the starting point would be that every department's operational budget would be 98% of last year's operational budget. Notice I used the word operational. That means the things that you need to do to pay the benefits and everything like that, but not the benefits themselves. And they should be able to do that without any diminished services whatsoever. Should produce the same services you've got before. Every government department would be funded for its core business activities only. By that, I mean that anything that doesn't belong as a core business activity of this department goes. I helped at the time when the Department for Homeland Security was created. There are 24 big government departments in Washington. 19 of them managed to convince everybody that they had a major Department of Homeland Security role. That is clearly wrong. There's probably about 4 or 5 at the most. But what this says is you don't fund the same thing in 5, 10, 15 or 20 departments. You pick out the one that's best at it, and that's where it stays. The federal relationship with the states would be based on block grants of monies for outcomes. Instead of the federal government trying to dictate exactly how you would do things, it would decide how much money you were entitled under this particular program, give it to the state and let them make decisions about how they did it. They couldn't spend it on something else. It had to be spent on the same outcome. What happens then is if you've got 50 laboratories that are looking at doing things differently, and you're going to get better results. You're also going to get some worse results. But that's just the problem of the people who live in that state. And what they should do if they don't like those results is fire their current elected officials and get some ones that are going to do a better job. Activities that are not a fair charge against the taxpayer would be converted to user pays. What's that sort of mean? I don't think the taxpayers should pay anything for the TSA. That should be a charge to travellers. If I never travel, I should never have to pay for it. That's a cost of travelling. So that's where that cost should fall. It shouldn't fall on taxpayers. The government will become a purchaser of goods and services from the best provider. So you look from the best providers. You don't necessarily buy it from your own agency. If there's somebody that can do it better, you buy it from there. And then what you do by that is create competition between the private sector and the public sector for the delivery of services. Capital charge will be imposed on departments for unutilized capital. Now, capital charge is an accounting mechanism that you use to try and flush out unutilized capital. Government departments are great at buying things, then never using them, but never ever selling them, just sitting on them. Places like defence departments are particularly bad for doing things like that. They have used huge tracts of land and everything like that that's sitting idle. What you do with the capital charge is that when you fund that agency, you fund it for all of its activities and for the capital that it's using, including its capital charge. But you don't fund it for the capital charge on the capital that it's not using. It has to find that out of its ordinary budget. So there's a very large financial incentive for them to actually start to surrender capital that's not used. Currently, the federal government has 55,000 buildings that are empty and unutilized. That's a massive waste of capital, and that's probably a small one. So, curbing entitlements. Converting things to block grants and looking at entitlements is something that I think the incentives have worked in reverse. So, what I would suggest is that entitlement programs will be fully funded each fiscal year from payroll taxes. And that would include Medicaid. Because if these are entitlements and they're meant to be about the welfare of the nation as a whole, everybody should pay. And payroll taxes is the only mechanism that we have at the moment that enables that to happen. But also, there should be a consequence for elected legislators at the moment when they decide to increase the entitlement or to improve the circumstances of the entitlement. And that consequence is that they would also have to immediately raise taxes. And if you put those two things together, then they're going to have to weigh them up. And I think that some of the things that we've seen in recent years, like the prescription benefit that was passed under the Bush administration, would not have happened if there had to be an increase in taxes, in the payroll tax at the same time. So, just creating the right kind of incentives. Entitlement trusts would not be allowed to accumulate surpluses in excess of 1% of outlays. My experience over time says to me that if there is cash on the table, politicians will spend it. And the only safe way to deal with that is get it off the table straight away. So a few years ago, when adjustments were made to the payroll taxes in the United States, it was considered that it would be a good idea if you built up some reserves to be able to deal with demographic changes. So what happened was that the politicians saw that bundle of money out there, decided that they would take it, spend it, write an IOU, and now not only do you not have the nest egg, out of the other revenues you're going to have to fund Social Security, Medicare, because the federal government's used up $2.2 trillion of those surpluses. So no surpluses. I would shift Medicare and Medicaid to block grants and let the states operate them, give them significant freedom in how they go about doing it, and by doing that, creating the opportunity for a lot of best practice to be identified. It's also illogical to say that the circumstances that prevail in Florida are identical to the circumstances that prevail in Wyoming, so they should be able to operate in exactly the same way. That is not true. They're different populations, they have all sorts of different issues, and they should be able to adjust for those. So that fully funding of entitlements from payroll taxes would have the effect of raising taxes every time entitlements are increased, and put that pressure on the political class. Here's the hidden big spender. Everybody knows about discretionary spending, and that's gone through with a fine-tooth comb every year, and I'm not going to spend any time on that. There's some opportunities there, but I don't want to spend time on that. The one that people don't well understand is tax expenditures. That's when you get a special credit for whatever it might be, or a special investment allowance or whatever. They actually are greater now than discretionary spending. And they are often not well designed or high priority spending initiatives. So, I'd say that they're all terminated, the whole lot. Some of that, when you terminate them, some of it would go to income tested social support. For example, the home mortgage deduction, I'd wipe out altogether, gone. But for people who needed accommodation assistance, I would make something available to them. In fact, I don't think that the home mortgage deduction is a benefit to people buying homes at all, because I think that that has already been built into the price of the home in the first place, and if it wasn't there, then home prices would settle a little bit. So some of that would also go to tax reductions, and some of it would go to deficit reduction, but you've got $1.3 trillion. I'd say that social policy in future will be delivered by direct payment to individuals on a needs-tested basis. So you're not going to pay it to people who don't need it on a universal basis any longer, just pay it to people on a needs-tested basis. And that you do that directly to them, instead of trying to do it through the tax code where it's messy. And that social policy would be delivered through the states via block grants. Just give a block grant for their entitlement to community development block grants, give that to the state in one foul swoop. TANF, give it to the state in one foul swoop. So you decide how you're going to utilize this. If a state decided to make the criteria more general for social policy, then that would be a debt to the state. Wouldn't be picked up by the federal government. And then you would reconfigure federal departments to an allocation and auditory role. So all of the things that they do at the moment would go, and that would be a reduction of about 30% in size for most of those government departments when you converted them to that. They're going to talk a little bit about taxes, because it seems like Uncle Sam now wants all of your money. And so we all have to accept that raising the revenue that's needed is necessary. There are things that we need to do. But it would be good if we had a set of principles that drove that decision making. And I say that those principles should be fairness. Is this reasonably fair to everybody concerned? Impartiality. We're not picking out one group of taxpayers as opposed to another group of taxpayers and treating them differently. It has to look at competitiveness. Is this going to improve our competitiveness to be able to trade and our businesses to flourish? And transparency. At the moment, what happens with a lot of taxes in the United States is that they're non-transparent because of the structure of the income-earning entities. So if you had a farm say two people, Tim and I have two farms, they're identical, and we make exactly the same amount of money, $150,000. And I treat mine as a sole operator. So I pay tax as an individual. And at 30%, that's around $45,000 a year. Tim converts his into a company because of a whole lot of reasons, but he converts his into a company. Exactly the same income, but he's got to pay 30% on $150,000 as company tax for a start. That's $45,000. Then he gets whatever it is in his hand, and he has to pay income tax on top of that. So now he's down to $85,000. He's got to pay another 30% on that. So two identical operations. One's paid about $60,000 tax. The other one's paid $45,000. Not fair. And that's because of non-transparency. What should happen is that you should get a credit for the taxes that are paid at other levels. And that's very transparent. So that in the end, everybody pays the same tax, but you've got a credit for the taxes that were paid because capital gains taxes were paid on this, because corporate taxes were paid on this, whatever it might be. And in the end, you would actually find out that Mitt Romney's tax rate was actually 46%, not 15%. And that's the actual number. If you looked at all of the different levels of his income paid tax before he received it and his final taxes, he paid 46%, not 15%. And that's what I mean by transparency. All tax deductions with the exclusion of the cost of earning income and charitable giving will be repealed. So all of those other exclusions and exemptions, they're gone. Why do I leave charitable giving there? Because charitable giving funds a very important sector of the economy, and that's the volunteer sector. And if we took that away, most of the caring within our societies would be diminished or wiped out, and that would not be a good thing to do. Deserving activities in the future would be funded by direct payments on a needs basis. In other words, if the oil companies need some money to be able to drill for oil, they're going to ask for a subsidy. They're not going to get a tax credit any longer. You see, the psychology of asking for a subsidy is very different to asking for a tax credit. And it makes it so much harder. It then also actually has to compete with every other item of spending on the government's agenda. So you've got to weigh that up against spending on higher education. You've got to weigh it up against spending on health. You've got to weigh it up against spending on any of the other things that the government does, defence, etc. And many of those things would not stand that test if they had to do it on a greenfields or a fair basis. So all industry-specific tax credits would be abolished. The subsidies for industry and agriculture would be abolished. And income and corporate tax rates would be adjusted down to compensate for these changes. Risk management. This is sort of the current Nevada approach to risk management, and we need to do better. The new philosophy for risk management would be that the government is to shift risk away from the government. And for decades it's been shifting risk to the government. How does it do that? By giving guarantees to things that it's not very smart to give guarantees to. Because frequently when people do that, they think there's no cost until there is a cost. And then you find that there's nothing you can do about it. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, nobody thought they were going to go broke. But they did. And you propped them up. So shifting risk away is what we should be looking to do. So bankruptcy without government intervention would be the market mechanism for dealing with failing enterprises. No bailouts. If your business gets screwed up, then that's your problem. You've got to deal with it. You've got to start again. Here's something that's interesting if you think about that. Is that really that bad? If you went back to 1900 and you identified the 500 top companies in the United States, and then you went forward to the year 2000, 100 years later, there is only one company in the US that made both lists. Guess? GE. Yeah, General Electric's the only company that made both lists. Was America any the worse because those other companies no longer were in the top 400? No, that was the greatest century of prosperity that the world has ever seen. That's creative destruction. It's caused by something better coming along and replacing the old thing. It's necessary for that to happen, and the process of bankruptcy is one of the ways of clearing that out. But normally what happens is that they are merged or absorbed by other companies, and the good assets are rescued and used, and the other ones are just discarded. And that's an essential part of the process. I would reform the Fed to have only one goal, and that's price stability. No employment goals. All of its policy, in my view, in the last 15 years has been directed towards trying to improve employment, and it has totally failed. And you can't do that with monetary policy, in my view. It's a factor of other policies more than it's a factor of monetary policy. All current formal and implied guarantees would be revoked, and gross national debt would be maintained at less than 60% of GDP. And that I would require that government would require express permission of Congress to go into deficit. Because I'm thinking about a government that's in surplus every year, not in deficit. Because I mentioned that a bit at the start about surpluses. I'm thinking about a government that's perennially in surplus. And that's actually where it should be. And that it would be an extraordinary event when you went into deficit. But if that's going to happen, make the politicians go and very publicly say, we're going to go into deficit. So make them say why. What's caused this? We've overspent. Or we didn't properly calculate the cost of some of the things that we've initiated. What they're going to have to do is admit publicly to a failure. They don't like doing that, I can assure you. Make them tell the public how long you're going to be in deficit and how you're going to pay that off and how long it will be before you're back to the debt situation you were in before those deficits occurred. I know a few countries that have done that. I can think about 4 or 5. Until the recession, not one of them had gone back into deficits because nobody wanted to have to go to Parliament and ask permission to be able to run a deficit. Debt reduction. I don't think there's any bidders for this one. Debt reduction is something that you have to focus on when you get into a bad debt situation. In your own personal finances, if you get overextended, your credit cards have got too much stuff on it, you've got to think about debt reduction. That means paying down the bill. Sometimes paying down the bill means selling some of the assets. So you've got to sell your bicycle, or you've got to sell your boat, or you've got to sell your racehorses, or whatever it might be. But you've got to sell some things to be able to deal with the fact that you've overexpended. You know, if you get your finances out of whack, what you lose is a significant part of your liberty. You don't have as many choices left if you're carrying a lot of debt and you're overspending. Governments are exactly the same. If you get that out of whack, you lose a significant part of your liberty. You don't have the ability to be able to invest more heavily in the military if you think that's necessary. Or you don't have the ability to be able to invest more heavily in something else if you think that's necessary, because you're now carrying this burden of debt. So, low priority assets would be privatized, and all of the proceeds would be used for debt reduction until the debt was below 60% of GDP. This is exactly what we did in my country. It's exactly what the Canadians did as well, and so did the Australians. So you're looking for a debt ratio that sits normally somewhere between 30 and 40%, but I would make 60 the first target goal. What are some of the things you could sell? Recoverable oil and gas. This is one of my colleagues came up with this number. I got to question it a bit, 128 trillion. This is recoverable oil and gas on federal lands. I don't know, even if it's half that, it's a big number. I'd be very happy to sell the TSA, the FDIC, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, seaports and airports, USPS, the Pension Guarantee Corporation, the government's fleet of cars, FEMA, research facilities, the gold reserves, don't know why we need those, NASA, the Mint, patents and trademarks, roads, forests, radio spectrum, government buildings, government lands, corporates, Corps of Engineers. There's a whole shrew of things. But if I were doing that, I'd be looking for $1 trillion in 4 years to be used exclusively for debt reduction. There are things you could just terminate. These are things that you just go through and you'll just wipe out. Don't come Monday, job's over. National Labour Relations Board, the Office of Federal Housing Oversight, Consumer Protection Board, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, etc. You could give them away, you could sell them, You might have to pay people to take some of them, but get rid of them. I actually had to pay people to take some irrigation schemes because they had negative value. But it was better to pay them to take them than leave them there for a risk that we were going to have to manage at a later date. And there's probably about 100 or more government agencies that you could just terminate. So get rid of those things. This is what's been driving the problem, a spending addiction. This is in 2005 numbers. It would look different if I used it just in dollars of the year. But you can see that that line is pretty steady upwards. And we need to get on top of that. So we do have a spending problem. It's not a taxing problem. It's a spending problem. And we have to accept that that's the cause of our current crisis. We're also getting to the stage where excessive government consumption crowds out the private sector and diminishes economic growth. So we're growing more slowly than we should, because when you put together local, state and federal activities, in many places it's now taking 40 to 45% of GDP. There is not enough room left for the private sector to be able to create the jobs and the wealth that's necessary for us to prosper. Margaret Thatcher, God bless her, who died just recently, you can't tax your way to prosperity. Hasn't sunk in Washington yet, I can tell you, but it needs to. If we go back and look at the last year before the effect of the recession was felt, that's 2007. Most Americans think that was a pretty good year. A lot of Americans would be happy to go back to that year. So if we did that, is there room to be able to do that? Well, this is the increase in spending in each of these major spending areas over that period of time. If you look at pensions, they're up by 40%. If you look at health care, it's up by 36%, but by next year, it's probably going to be up by 56%. If you look at defence, it's up by 42%. Welfare is up by 60%. Interest is interesting, and it's only up by a tiny fraction. That's because interest rates have come down. That's because the Fed's made your dollars worth less money. And in total, government spending is up by 37.3% over that period of time. There is tons of room to be able to go back, because none of that spending is yet deeply embedded. It takes about 4 years for government spending to become embedded and people to become reliant on it. Up to that period of time, you can withdraw it, and it doesn't have too marked an effect. So what I'm proposing here are massive changes. It needs to be a permanent fix. And it needs to be fixed in such a way that the spending problem can't grow back again. Our experience of that was that government spending was too big, the government was too big. We reduced the size of government by 66% if you looked at it in terms of the workforce. We reduced it in size and by about 50% if you looked at government's share of GDP. It takes a while for that to grow back. Now, some of the departments and agencies, we reduced from, the transportation went from 5,600 people to 53. Even if it has a 10% increase in staff, it's only 5 people. Whereas if it had 10% increase in staff when it was 5,600, it's a lot of people. So the structural change needs to be significant to be able to deal with that. I would see these changes acting cumulatively, but doing it in 4 years. The most successful processes around the world have happened in 4 years, and anybody that's tried to take a longer period of time has generally failed. Canada, it took 4 years. New Zealand, it took 4 years. Australia, it took 3 years. In the United Kingdom, it took 4 years. In Finland, it took 3 years. But all around that time frame, because that's about as long as you can hold the political coalition together for. You can't keep it much longer than that before people start to break ranks. When you do that, you find that economic growth all of a sudden bounces back. There's a reason why Canada has been growing faster than the United States in recent years. And it's because they got their fiscal house in order during the 1990s and were in much better shape to handle the recession than the United States was. People are going to tell you that the sequester is a massive spending reduction and we can't take any more than that. Well, these two lines show you what would happen without the sequester to spending over the next 10 years. That's the blue line. And the red line tells you what happens with the sequester. And frankly, if that's the best you can do, you probably shouldn't have bothered starting. That's nowhere near enough to be able to deal with the problem. We've got to think in terms of the scale. If you also look at that, you'll see that it doesn't reduce spending at any period of time. It just slightly slows the rate of growth. Well, there are some agencies of government where you can certainly reduce by bringing them down to zero and not letting them grow again. So, here are just some things that I would have on my wish list. One of the things that I think is a failure in fiscal administration in the United States is that you can't put your finger on any person inside the administration who's responsible for the budget. And don't say the president, because it shouldn't be. That's not his job. Somebody should advise him to do that, but there's no person. It's not like a minister of finance that you see in other governments or a treasurer. There needs to be somebody, very publicly identifiable. Does anybody know who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget? Well, he possibly is the person responsible for the budget, but nobody knows him. So that's a problem. In Congress and the House, nobody's responsible for the budget outcome. The appropriators, the budget committees set the budget caps and everything like that at the start. The appropriators then go and totally ignore them and spend whatever it is that they like. And then the acts, the appropriation acts are passed, and they finally leave it to Treasury to sequester the spending down to the budget cap. Well, I hate that idea. We elect Congress to actually make those darn decisions. We shouldn't hand it over to bureaucrats to in the end decide that this is going to be funded and that's not. There needs to be a super budget committee in the House. I'd say it's 9 members, and that it has the power to veto all of the decisions of appropriators, and it's responsible for producing a responsible budget in the end. One that's going to balance, one that's going to see that there isn't debt escalation, one that's going to invest in the things that are necessary for the country to prosper. My last comment would be that I think that the United States is in, this is a long-term project, is in desperate need of a rewriting of its major statutes. What happens over time is that you have a law and then it gets amended and over the next 150 years it becomes a total mess. And every now and again, just like cleaning house, you've got to have a rethink about it and say, what would this look like if we started from scratch again today and we wrote a law that was appropriate to today's circumstances? My country did that, and one of the laws that we did was the environmental laws. And the best way to describe it was that if you stack them up, they were 43 inches before we started. And the new law is called the Resource Management Act, and it's 348 pages. And all that 43 inches was repealed. That's the second part that's important, because you repeal all of the old. And when you repeal the old laws, you also kill every single one of the regulations that depended on those laws. So they've got to go back and rethink the regulations, and that's the best way that I've ever found being able to tidy up the regulatory mess that most countries get into. Okay, debt and irresponsible spending diminishes our freedoms. It's something that we should really think about. Thank you, everybody. Happy to take some questions.